There's so much that I want to talk about in this space, and that may or may not be good for you. But it's just a feast of history and material culture. By material culture, what I mean is that historians use, traditionally, documents to write history. Letters, newspaper articles, journals. Material culture scholars like myself ask questions of objects. How do objects animate history? You may have the correspondence of George Washington and feel like you understand him well, but what does it mean for somebody to have diamond-encrusted buckles on high-heel shoes? What is a wig about? All these sort of things that, what is that, right? There are all these things about ourselves. If you think, somebody just found your letters, they may know something about you, but if they're in your home, went through your stuff, then they'd really know even better, right? So North Avenue represents so many things. And I want to talk a few minutes about kind of that overview history, and then we'll talk about the windows in particular, if that's okay. The irony of this church, there were two windows here that are now in the library of the church. But there was John Knox and John Calvin, right? And Martin Luther. Okay. So, irony is, irony is Andrew Jackson on a $20 bill, right? Closed down the national bank, caused the economy to tank. Hated the federal, bank. Okay. Irony is John Calvin in a stained glass window. As you probably well know, one of the ways that Protestants reformed the church was by destroying it physically. The theology of fallenness claimed that because the earth was irredeemably fallen, one could not take dirt or minerals, or in this case with glass, silica, sodium bicarbonate, potash, and make something holy. Okay? So for people like Calvin and Zwingli and Knox, there was no sacred space on earth. There was no such thing as holiness on the earth. That God alone was holy and removed, right? And that the idea of salvation was so tied up in the Bible that one, read the Bible, heard the Bible preached, and that this was the way, one was saved, largely. The ordinances, or, like baptism, communion, these were not sacraments. There was no magic in them, Calvin would say. They were symbolic exercises. And so anything that distracted from that was, in their words, popish, pagan, and verboten. So beginning in Geneva, he gets a bunch of people, and they go through and they literally yank the statues off of the walls and destroy them. They take hammers to the stained glass windows. They destroy the organ. All the paintings are painted over, right? And so what that does is it creates, in some ways, what we think of as quite a modern space, a clean interior, where the only focus and the only object that was given some ornamental carving was the pulpit, which represented the preached word of God. That spilled over to other areas. Necessary to understand this church is John Knox, a real founder of Presbyterianism, who is also what you call an iconoclast. Martin Luther wasn't as much an iconoclast as the others were. So if you were to come to colonial Georgia, colonial New England especially, you would see churches that were quite spare. In New England, you wouldn't even be able to tell it's a church. It would just look like some sort of big barn type building. And it was called a meeting house. There was a church communicated sacredness and holiness. So there was no such thing as a church, there was a meeting house, right? And there were no crosses. That became a symbol of Protestant faith in the beginning in the early 19th century with Anglicans, but toward the late 19th century, it really takes off again. So this church represents a big change. And how many of you today have found yourself saying, I can't believe what my kids are doing. I can't believe what music my grandkids like. I can't believe what TV shows they think are good, or what they're doing to our church, how they're changing the church. So this is what happened at this time. Beginning in the 1700s in the King's Chapel in Boston, the wealthy patron bought an organ, a little pump organ, and for the church. It was the first organ to go in an colonial American church. And the pastor said, I will raise the money to pay you. No. The pastor obtained it, and the wealthy guy said, I will pay you what you paid for it if you'll go throw it in the river. Because this is not what proper Christians do, is have organ music that distracts from the word, right? And so you fast forward, in the early 19th century, Protestants start putting stained glass windows in, but they're not figural. They don't have pictures, right? They're just ornamental windows, kind of like the 3 demi-lune windows on the front of this building. But by the later 19th century, there's been a huge revolution. And a lot of the grandparents are not happy about it because they feel that the new generation is really throwing away what they had lived and died for. And there are some churches that actually schism over these debates, whether we have organ music or a choir, whether we have ornament and statuary, whether we use the cross or not. And so you'll find churches in the same town where they just parted ways on these issues. So the way that churches like this, they do this a couple ways. The first way is by saying, well, we understand what our forefathers were thinking, but they were a little overboard. Okay, they went a little bit too far. A second way is by just rejecting Calvinism altogether. That had already begun during the Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, but then you get people like Henry Ward Beecher he's in various places, but he lands in New York and Brooklyn, just saying they were just flat wrong, and bring it all back. And other people do that. There's also the powerful ideology of beauty in the 19th century that says that beauty shapes one's moral character. And that if you want to raise your children to have refinement, gentility, polish, then you need to have furniture and draperies in your house that have these characteristics, because they will rub off on the children. And they will be edified, and they will become like those furnishings, right? So there's an environmental determinism that influences the way. And many Protestants grew up in this. And so they said to themselves, well, if that's true in the home, why isn't it true in the meeting house? Why can we have beautiful stuff there but not there? And so there's this tension, and it's sort of negotiated by people. And here you see the results of such a negotiation in the early 20th century. So one of the ways that Protestants get around this problem of stained glass windows is they had always been allowed to have images of the Bible and Bible stories in their houses. So Protestants for 300 years published illustrated Bibles. And some of the most famous ones in the 19th century were published by a guy named Gustave Doré. And so all of these parlors would have this, big Bible on a lectern, and an illustrated Bible, and you look through it, and all the pretty pictures, right? And so you could perform your pious domesticity there. So one of the ways they do that is they say, oh, we're just going to illustrate the Bible. We're not distracting from the preached word of God. And that's how you get windows like these. So if we start here with, I don't remember, this one's the first one. I've got you going, sorry. These stained glass windows, the central medallions. These are copies of popular illustrations or popular paintings by a German artist named Heinrich Hoffmann. Hoffmann was one of the most famous painters of his time. People would have what they called chromolithographs or chromos in their houses of Hoffmann and other German painters' pictures. You would find needlework samplers of Hoffmann and others like that, right? And so here, Christ and the children and Christ preaching in the temple, I was about my Father's business. These were offered by Tiffany to clients. So there's a private collector in the United States who owns some of the only existing sales sample books that Tiffany ever made. And what they are, it's just a small volume that has hand watercolored, drawn pen and ink, and then watercolored drawings that one could go through and say, oh, I like that, or I like that, or what about this with that, or what if we did that but we changed it to blue, and Grandma's favorite flowers were irises, so can we do irises instead of morning glories? Sure. So in that book, there are also cutouts of prints by Heinrich Hoffmann. And so instead of them drawing it, they can just say, yeah, we can also just make you the Hoffmann window that everybody wants. And so that is one of the ways that, so you have, sort of illustrated Bible galleries. And some churches will have even more of the same, that'll all be taken from popular Bible illustrations. So you can raise your children, they've seen these stories at home, they've seen them here, and they can come here and they can see them, no problem. One of another characteristic of the stained glass of the time that this church exemplifies best in Atlanta, is what we call flashing. I'm not going to take off my pants. But flashing is a technique that is used on glass. So in these windows, you have the cross, which is now a symbol of Christian faith for Protestants, and on the other side, this crown. So notice how radiant the intersection of the cross is, how light that is, and how it radiates out to light blue and then a dark blue on the edges. What you're looking at in this pane is at 2 and maybe more, I've seen them 5, pieces of glass that are layered upon each other. Okay? So the top one, it has this little bit of a mottled texture to it. But then behind it, if I were to take this off, you'd see other layers of glass. And what happened there is they made a flat piece of glass. And then that piece of glass was cooled. And then I don't know what the right word is, but let's call it a skim coat of another color was poured on top of that layer. In this case, it was probably blue of some sort. So here, then they put this blue glass. So now I have what looks like a solid piece of blue glass, okay? Then I take some sort of a tar resist, like let's think of, like masking tape it off, right? I mask it off with this pattern. And then I get acid, hydrofluoric acid that's diluted in water. And I use a paintbrush and I paint on that thin layer of blue. And what that does is it eats it away. So then I've done this to where I feel like I've got the right gradual effect. So it's not a stark, harsh line, but that I've eaten away a lot of that blue flashed glass. Then I clean that off and then wash off or scrape off the rest of the stuff that resisted the acid, which was around here, right? And so then, now what I have is a piece of glass that has the rays are etched, acid etched into that thin layer. And then there are probably other layers behind it of different colors that were flashed glass. The reason they call it flashing is because it's so fast. It's just a flash coat of glass on it. It dries and you etch it away. And so up close, you can gradually see it. It sort of undulates in its color, but when I'm across the room from that one, right, I'm like, oh, wow. So there are probably layers of green glass and blue glass and gold glass behind that crown that made it radiate like that. So this is another way that Tiffany artisans conceived of, or another method, that one could paint with the glass instead of painting on the glass, like these two windows are painted on. The iconography here, thank you. The iconography is also important. It points the audience back to the Bible. Not only in the illustrations of Jesus, but in the four figures that are in these roundel windows on the right. All these figures, right, have wings, even though they are like a lion, or an ox, right? And the eagle comes with wings, so that's a freebie. Well, what's going on there? What is that about? That's the Gospels, right? And so where does this come from? Well, if you think of Assyrian symbols you'll have this it looks like a big bull with a head on it, or Egyptian, like you have the Sphinx that it looks like a lion, but then it has a human head on it. There's a common feature like those Assyrian features that has a bull with a face and a big wing on it. That part of the culture of the ancient Near East had this sort of zoomorphic blended with anthropomorphic figures that were in their deities. In Ezekiel chapter 1, the prophet Ezekiel is in exile. He's in Babylon. And one of the things that they've lost in the sack of Jerusalem is the temple. And they have dreams of rebuilding a new temple. And you get that from this exilic scripture. Ezekiel describes seeing a heavenly temple that should be like a prototype. And on that, he says he sees God sitting on a throne. And swirling about that throne are four winged creatures. And one is an ox, an eagle, a man, and a lion, right? And they are swirling about the throne of God. Then, in the book of Revelation, John the Revelator repeats this, and it becomes a motif that is in the literature there of the apocalypse. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and an early Christian father, a theologian named Irenaeus, says, I think there's something here. I think that these four symbols in the book of Revelation, Ezekiel, they represent the four Gospels. And later, Jerome will say the same thing. Augustine, oh yeah, I'm on board. Aquinas, sure. And it continues through the centuries. The thing is, they all disagreed on which figure went with which gospel. So, by the 19th century, and the time these were installed, you have Mark is the lion, Like St. Mark's in Venice has this, big line, right? John is the eagle, and some people say that's because it was the most robust gospel. It has the highest Christology, which in fancy pants language, that's just a fancy word to mean, there from the beginning, Christ is the light of the world. He knows at the outset he's going to be crucified. It's not like Mark, where he's a rabbi, and there's a different level of certainty about the outcome of all this. And so these symbols became a way to communicate and to reiterate the importance of the gospel, right? Now, so you have in this window this sort of tension within Protestantism, that you have the Bible illustration, and then the windows on top called, if you want another fancy pants word for the day, it's called the tetramorph, which just simply means, four shapes, four figures. But that's what scholars would call it, the tetramorph. So you have that, but then on the bottom you have not only a cross, but a jeweled cross with this big chunky stone right in the center. That's, again, one of those hand-faceted stones. And then the green stones around it are also the hand-chunked stones. And then stylized Cairo monograms to the side. This you might call an eschatological cross. In the early years of Christianity, what does that mean? That's a useless thing. Let's say 5th century. Theologians and writers start talking about the cross as having a life of its own, that the cross is an actor. It has sentient agency in a way in the drama of the passion of Christ. And there's a way that it turns the first century on its head. Early Christians did not use this type of cross as a symbol of their faith. It didn't come in for hundreds of years. Maybe somebody knows why for sure, but the best educated guesses are it was an embarrassment at the first, right? At the beginning, you didn't want there was a sort of, God wasn't supposed to die, right? The deities don't die in Roman culture. If you think of all these tough guys who are on steroids, riding in the clouds. And so if you were to say to somebody, oh yeah, our God died, it's like, oh, well, which culture killed him? And you get that, right, with the battling of gods in ancient mythology. And so they didn't foreground that as a symbol of their faith. Instead, they used things like the ichthus fish, the Cairo monogram, the peacock, grapevines, different things like that. But later, it does come in. And what happens is the cross is recalibrated, not as a symbol of loss, but as a symbol of victory. And that Christ's victory over death. And that the cross was therefore instrumental in that. And that the cross itself will return at the second coming. If you go to some of the baptistries in Ravenna, Italy, for example, you'll see mosaics of a big chair, like a throne, with a cross sitting on the throne. That the cross itself stands in for Christ, right? And then writers talk about the way the eschatological cross will return before his coming as a sign. And so if we look at, let's say, a Byzantine cross that's all jeweled and say, oh, it's just because it's pretty, that's missing part of the theology, the way that many were thinking about this, and especially about the end of the world, that the idea of the end of the world and second coming has been right on the surface for Christians for 2,000 years. Charlemagne, the year 1000, those were, it's any day now, it's going to happen. And throughout that time, even before, there's this idea, and so the cross gets wrapped up in that. So for Presbyterians to embrace that, right, and embrace that type of cross, a jeweled cross, is a profound revolution in aesthetics. The first is, I talked about the Gothic revival and how the Gothic revival paved the way for Tiffany Studios, right? But there's a tension there. Well, if the Gothic revival is what it's about, then why do these windows not look Gothic? Okay? And I want to address that. So, when I say a Gothic window, I mean something that is made in that tradition of just a painted, cathedral glass, but also the way that Gothic figures are stylized. They're more two-dimensional. And these are a little more realistic than what you would find in medieval Europe cathedrals. If you go to Saint-Denis or Amiens or one of those, you'll see that the figures are very stylized and very angular and two-dimensional. Whereas, notice the realism of the Tiffany faces, okay? So, there was a debate at the time, because what happens is Tiffany windows, in order to be realistic, right, they can't be Gothic, two-dimensional stylized. He was interested in doing something different, and so was John Lafarge. So this type, this style, it came to be known as American-style stained glass. And it really is a new thing under the sun. Tiffany himself in the studio was a new thing under the sun in terms of decorative arts and the fine arts. I'll give you an example. His glass shop not only made windows and lamps, but they made beautiful vases. And they made beautiful stemware, flatware. So a lot of some of his glass work was exhibited at a Paris International Exposition. And that exposition, he won these medals. They gave out medals, for best plow, best seeds, best whatever, and so he won this. And then a European dealer named Siegfried Bing learned about him, visited him, and over here, and opened up or brought Tiffany into his gallery, and that gallery was called the Art Nouveau Gallery, and that's where the name of the style comes from. It's just this guy's shop. But Tiffany, in many ways, was the first American to turn the heads of the French. For centuries, the French had led out in taste. Porcelain, fabrics, architecture, you name it. That it was, there's a reason that the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg looks French, right? It's because Peter and Catherine looked to the French court. We need to be like them. Why are the greatest ballet companies in the world in Russia? It's because of that trying to be, we're gonna out-French the French. That's what we're gonna do. And so the United States and the American colonies, they were sort of a provincial outpost. And nobody from France said, oh, look at this beautiful chest of drawers that was carved in Boston. They would say, oh, that's cute. If you're ever in Paris, by the Louvre, there's a museum of decorative arts that is the most fabulous collection of furniture. And you see that French furniture and you go, okay, I get it. I get it. This is the real deal. But you can also do that when you're a king and you're taxing peasants and all your dukes and everything like that. I mean, there's a reason the French Revolution happened. For heaven's sakes, Marie Antoinette has this boudoir dressing mirror that is cast out of solid silver. Yeah, and so, yeah, with money, you can do a lot of things. But what happens is Tiffany is able to gain their acclaim, and then this new style of window that pops on. At the same time, you have people who don't like it. They are like the Ruskins, they're like the Morrises that say, no, it needs to look Gothic. And the leader of that charge in the United States is an architect named Ralph Adams Cram. And Cram did a lot of important architecture, and it was always very Gothic. And he used a studio most often that's called conic. And I'll give you the story. If you've ever been on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, there's a huge church called the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. And that church was originally supposed to be a sort of Byzantine revival church. And the center section is still there. And at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, a donor, I believe her name was Cecilia Whipple, bought this beautiful Byzantine chapel that's now in the Morse Museum in Winter Park and installed it at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine. Well, fast forward, all of a sudden, we're not going to use this architect, we're going to switch to a different architect, and they hire Cram. And he says, well, the first thing that's going is that Tiffany chapel. He had nothing good to say about it, right? And didn't want it in there. So Tiffany bought it back from them and took it to his house and put it in a building outside. And then there are churches that Cram designed that then the parishioners commissioned a Tiffany window for. He was just beside himself, right? And so there's a debate among people of what's appropriate for Protestantism, what's appropriate for Catholicism, right? And so one of Tiffany's colleagues, an architect named Stanford White, he will argue that only a neoclassical church would be appropriate for Protestant worship, which is exactly the opposite of what the Protestants in England are teaching, right? They see that as Italy and Rome. And he's like, no, that is appropriate. So although we look at these things and say, oh, they may look all similar, they're actually symbols of debates going on at the time. And they're negotiated solutions of identity. Why are some windows signed and other windows are not signed? I don't know. Nobody knows, but there is a guess, a little bit of a guess. At least there's some pattern in the evidence. I don't know of any. There may be out there. There are people who know more than I. If say you bought a window for your house, it was a beautiful landscape window that would go over a breakfast nook. Usually those aren't signed. Anything that went in a private space. But things that went in public spaces, that's where you find more signatures. And so there's advertising, there's branding. And one of the things about Tiffany that helped make his company successful was that last name. His father had already built a brand name for him. We live in a world that's saturated with branding. They didn't. You went to the mercantile and you just bought soap and flour and cornmeal. You didn't ask, well, what brand is it? And a lot of branding grew out of how do we make, if I sell the same soap as this company, how do I sell more of my soap? How do I convince them that the same thing is better? And so companies like Ivory, start little logos. And, oh, you need to buy Ivory soap. It's better because of this. Or you need to buy this cornmeal because, the others will kill your children. But when you pour it out, it's all the same. And there are things like that today, right? Watches, they're all made at the same factory in Bangladesh. but they put a different label on it. You know, I work for a, well, in furniture, it's that way. I've been to a furniture factory in Vietnam where they're making 3 brands at the same time. And so, so how to differentiate is an important thing. What was that? Oh, I thought I had a question. So what happens is Charles Tiffany, he was known as the King of Diamonds. His company invented what we today think of as the solitaire wedding ring and helped consolidate the idea that a diamond is what you have to buy. Early wedding rings just were a band, a gold band. But he's like, no, you need to get this, right? And that type of messaging is so powerful that advertising has and that culture has that they create needs in a public. The same thing happened with Easter dresses, wedding dresses, Christmas, that the manufacturers like, we've got this industrial equipment, we can crank out miles and miles of fabric, we need to sell more. So go create style. Oh, okay, there's a spring line, a summer line. Oh, here's the fall season. And all of a sudden, you need 4 suits. When 30 years before, why would I need more than 1 suit? Right? But you convince it. Now, if other people have it and you don't, you're looked down on, right? And so now tell a girl, oh, I'm just going to buy you, a nice turquoise wedding ring. Is that cool? It's not going to go over that well most of the time, right? And it's because of people like Charles Tiffany. And advertisers would include, like you can look in advertisements from typing machines, the Pallard, I don't know how it's pronounced, P-A-I-L-L-A-R-D, typewriter. It's the Tiffany of typewriters. Okay? So that idea, oh, this is really great, it helps Louis Tiffany. He didn't have to do anything. He just inherited it. And John Lafarge didn't have that. And so there's actually a lot of confusion in the public mind. Are they getting their windows from the same company as the jeweler, or is it different? And so I've looked in numerous church ledgers, and they will say Tiffany and Company. Check made to Tiffany and Company, which is the dad's company, totally different thing. But I'm convinced there's confusion amongst people. They think it's all the same. So that's one of the powerful things about branding that happens at that time. And so you put a signature on it. Yeah?
I'm curious, because you started saying the father thought the older sister was
a
business head, and Louis had his head in the clouds. And I saw a succession of companies. Was he a good businessman? Did he kind of get with the show? Or?
Well, I don't know. Some people, it's often said, oh, he was a great businessman. But that's just made because the company survived and was successful. But there's not a lot of data to back up that argument. Other than it didn't go bankrupt, I guess, until the very end, until he dies and they close. But there's a problem with Tiffany scholarship, and that's that no records from the company have survived. And that company would have had filing cabinets on filing cabinets of all sorts of drawings, proposals, contracts, media campaigns, newspaper clippings, all this stuff. And so Louis Tiffany, if I get the dates right, he dies in late 1932, and the company closes in 1933, the next year. And so somewhere in between his death and the closing of the company, those records, and we, in fairness, we do this. Oh, nobody's going to want this. Nobody's going to want this. When maybe, some of your grandchildren will be like, why did Grandma throw that away? Oh, it was just, this thing. And so who knows what happened to them? There are a few things that survived that are at the Morse Museum. Somehow those sketchbooks survived that I talk about, those advertising sample books. So I'm not confident enough saying, oh yeah, he was a great businessman. But it seems like he was, and maybe more importantly, it seems like he hired people who were. And that's really if you can find people who are willing to admit, I'm not good at this, and my business model is to hire people who are better than me, man, you've got a successful business. Most people, their egos won't take that. They won't take people working under them who are smarter or more capable than them. But if you can do that, you'll be way more successful at just enlisting talent. And he enlisted talent that way. And one of the things that he did in the last few minutes, which relates to this, is he hired a gentleman to be in the ecclesiastical department, who was a theologian, who was a church historian. And this gentleman helped gather precedents for symbols and for Christian paintings and stuff like that. Because my sense is Louis Comfort Tiffany didn't understand it, he didn't recognize it that much. He'd grown up in a conservative Presbyterian church, and even the windows that he designed for his dad's church in the Hudson River, they have no figures in them. They are just, is that my phone? No, good. Mom? Yes, Mom. So his dad's church had no figures in it. So he didn't grow up on all this Catholic Orthodox stuff. And he wasn't very religious. His father was that old Puritan stock. And they attended the Presbyterian church. It was the Madison Square Presbyterian Church in New York every week. And then it had family at dinner at Charles' house after. And then Charles passed away, and I don't think Tiffany ever went to church again. Yeah, you can tell his dad still had this sort of thing that, the family will be there. And he later said, my religion is beauty. But he enlisted people who could do all this stuff. Okay, yes, ma'am.
Are there any of his paintings available, one? And two, did he ever actually work in the glass, or was it merely his idea?
Okay, great question. She's asking, did he ever work in glass himself? And what about the paintings? Do any of those, are any available? I think by available, do you mean just survive? Yes. He also painted a lot of Orientalist school paintings, and would go to Morocco and Algiers and this type of stuff, right? And paint these romantic scenes of Middle Eastern people. Yes, a lot of his paintings survive. Most high-end museums will have examples of his paintings. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, will have several. The High Museum may have some, I'm not sure. He continued to paint throughout all his life. And that was, still a love of his. There's a museum on Long Island that had an exhibition of Louis Comfort Tiffany's paintings, and they have a large collection of them. Some of his descendants have some of his paintings. Yes, he did work in glass himself, and probably a lot. Does that mean he was the one adding the metallic oxides to the batch of glass? I doubt it. Does that mean he was the one with the rod and the puntal and he's spinning it? I doubt it. But maybe he learned some of that and was doing it. We just don't know. There's a lot of records of what went on in the glass houses later from a family by the last name of Nash. And they were the directors. Arthur Nash was the director of the glass house in Long Island. And later it takes his name. The Nash notebooks that there's a book about, show all this stuff. And the son of Arthur Nash, he's kind of angry because he's like, Louis Tiffany didn't do that, my dad did that. And that's all my dad's work. So it gets into this little bit of a blurry line, of is it the companies, is it just Tiffany? But they do say that he loved to come to the glass houses, and that he liked to spend time there more than into the studios, proving designs or whatever. That he loved saying, okay, could you make it a little more coppery? Maybe try this, and let's see if we could do this. And he loved that experimenting.